The monk never heard them coming. One moment the island of Lindisfarne sat wrapped in its usual gray morning fog, gulls circling the stone tower, the smell of salt and cold earth drifting through the chapel windows. The next moment, the sea itself was moving, and what was moving through it had no crosses on its sails. The year was 793, and before the sun finished rising, the most sacred ground in all of Christian England would be burning. What happened that morning didn't just destroy a monastery. It cracked open an entire age. Everything the monks believed about God, His protection, about the sanctity of holy ground, about the order of the world, all of it died on that beach. And the men who killed it had come from a direction no one had thought to guard. They came from the north, from the sea, from nowhere. Here's what you need to understand about Lindisfarne. This was not just a church. This was not just a building filled with gold and prayer books, though it had plenty of both. Lindisfarne was the spiritual heartbeat of northern England. It was where the most revered saints of the Christian world had walked, prayed, and been buried. It was considered, by nearly every Christian in Europe, to be untouchable, not because of walls or weapons, but because God Himself was believed to protect it. The monks who lived there did not train to fight. They trained to pray. They had no garrison, no warning system, no contingency plan for what was about to happen. Why would they? No one had ever dared. If Lindisfarne could fall, then nowhere was safe, and the people who were about to discover that truth had no idea it was coming. The raiders had not appeared from nothing. Across the cold gray seas to the north and east, in the fjords of what is now Norway, something had been building for generations. Populations growing, farmland shrinking, younger sons with no inheritance and no future staring at the ocean and asking a question that would reshape the world. What is out there, and who is stopping us from taking it? The answer, it turned out, was almost no one. The longship had been perfected over decades, shallow enough to beach directly on a coastline, fast enough to outrun almost anything the Christian world could launch against it, and seaworthy enough to cross open ocean in conditions that would terrify any other sailor alive. It was not a warship in any traditional sense. It was a delivery mechanism for violence, capable of appearing anywhere without warning and disappearing before a response could be organized. And on the morning of the 8th of June, 793, a small fleet of these ships was cutting through the North Sea toward a small tidal island off the Northumbrian coast. The monks had actually received warnings. Not useful warnings. Nobody arrived with swords drawn saying raiders were coming. Instead, in the weeks before the attack, the Anglo-Saxon sources described something stranger: violent whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, fiery dragons seen flying through the sky. These were almost certainly natural events, weather phenomena, meteors, possibly even the aurora borealis seen unusually far south. But the monks recorded them as omens, signs that something was coming. Something terrible. They prayed harder. They kept their routines. They had no framework for what an armed Norse raiding party even looked like, because nothing like this had happened before. Not here, not to them. The ships were close now. The men aboard them had been rowing and sailing for days. They were tired, salt-crusted, cold, and they were also completely aware of what was waiting on that island. Word had spread among Norse traders and explorers about the monasteries of the English coast. Undefended, wealthy, stuffed with gold and silver and jeweled books and reliquaries encrusted with gems. The church had been accumulating the donations of wealthy Anglo-Saxon nobles for over a century. All of it sitting behind stone walls with no soldiers and no warning system, because the people inside believed their God would protect them. The men in the longships had different gods, and their gods had no interest in mercy. The first thing the monks would have seen was the shape of the prows cutting through the morning fog. Viking longships were built to be terrifying. The carved dragon heads at the prow, the shields along the sides, the rhythmic dip of oars in dark water. All of it designed, consciously or not, to look like something mythological. Something that should not exist. The monks who were awake and happened to be near the shore at that moment would have had no category for what they were seeing. In their world, ships on the horizon meant trade, or pilgrimage, or perhaps an English lord arriving by sea. What bore down on them that morning belonged to a different world entirely. The raiders did not wait for parley. They did not send a messenger ahead to demand surrender. That was not how this worked. The entire advantage of the longship was speed and shock. Strike before anyone can respond. Take everything of value. Leave before a military force can be assembled and sent to stop you. The ships beached, and the men who poured off them were running before their feet hit the sand. Brother Ethelmund, and we do not know if this was his name, only that some monk was the first to see them clearly, probably had just enough time to understand what was happening before the screaming started. The Norse raiders came up from the beach in a loose, fast-moving group, not in formation, not in the disciplined ranks of a Roman army or an Anglo-Saxon shield wall. They came like a flood, spreading out, moving fast, hitting every entrance at once. The monks who ran were the ones who lived, at least for the moment. Some of the brothers were already in the chapel for the morning office when the doors burst open. The sources are fragmentary here, and what survives is filtered through horror and religious trauma. But what we know is this: the killing was immediate and indiscriminate. These were not soldiers following rules of engagement. These were men from a culture where raiding was a legitimate and even celebrated profession, where the goods and captives you brought home determined your status, where violence was a tool rather than a last resort. The gold was everywhere. That was the thing that must have hit the Norse raiders like a physical force. After weeks at sea, after cold and salt and darkness, they walked into a building literally dripping with wealth. Jeweled crosses, silver chalices, illuminated manuscripts bound in gold-stamped leather covers encrusted with gemstones, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, objects that represented decades of the finest craftsmanship in the entire Christian world. Reliquaries containing what the monks believed were the actual physical remains of saints, encased in gold and silver and ivory. Candelabra, altarpieces, donation bowls overflowing with coin. The raiders tore through all of it. What could be carried, they took. What was too heavy or too fixed, they stripped of whatever metal could be pried loose. Meanwhile, outside, the rest of the monastery was being systematically destroyed. The monks who had not made it to the chapel, those who had been in the gardens, the kitchens, the scriptoriums, the dormitories, found themselves running through their own courtyards with Norse warriors behind them. Some made it to the water and swam. Some hid. Some fought back with whatever they could find, tools, furniture, their bare hands, and were killed for it. Some, and this detail comes directly from the contemporary sources, were herded together and bound. Not killed, captured, because a living monk, healthy enough to survive a voyage across the North Sea, was a commodity. The slave markets of the Norse world had buyers for Christian captives, and educated monks who could read and write and illuminate manuscripts were particularly valuable. The fire came next. Of course, the fire came next. Burning what you could not take was both practical. It denied your enemies the use of the buildings, and symbolic, though the Norse raiders were probably not thinking in those terms. They were thinking in terms of time. How long had they been on the island? How long before someone on the mainland raised an alarm? How far could a fast rider get in an hour? The smoke would have been visible from the mainland. Thick, black, oily smoke rising from stone buildings that should not be capable of burning. But the wooden interior fittings, the stored grain, the hay, the oil lamps, the books themselves all fed the fire once it caught. The tower, the chapel roof, the dormitory longhouses, all of it burning while the ships, already loaded, already pushed back from the beach, caught the morning wind and began to move north and east. They were gone before any armed response could reach the island. The whole attack had taken, by most estimates, less than 3 hours. Think about what it meant to be one of the survivors. You are a monk in your 30s. You have lived on this island since you were a teenager, brought here as an oblate, a child given to the monastery by your family to serve God. You have spent the last 15 years copying manuscripts by candlelight, tending the monastery, its vegetable gardens, learning the Psalms in Latin, memorizing the liturgical calendar. Your entire understanding of the world is organized around the idea that God watches over his servants, that the holy men buried under this ground, Cuthbert, Aidan, the great saints of Northumbria, form a kind of spiritual shield around this place. And now you are crouching behind an outcrop of rock on the far side of the island, soaking wet from the sea, listening to the screaming stop. The screaming stopping is somehow worse than the screaming. You wait. You do not know how long. The smoke is visible from where you hide, a column of black rising into the gray sky. When you finally crawl back toward the monastery, what you find is almost incomprehensible. Buildings you have walked through every day of your adult life reduced to smoking rubble. The chapel, where you have knelt every single morning for 15 years, ransacked and partially burned. The altars stripped bare, the reliquaries smashed open. St. Cuthbert, its most treasured possessions scattered or stolen. And your brothers? The ones who did not run fast enough. Some are dead. Others are simply gone. And in some ways the gone ones are harder to process, because you know where they are going. Across the sea, to a world you cannot reach them in, to a life you cannot imagine for them and cannot bear to try. You are going to have to write a letter to the abbot in York. You are going to have to find words for this. There are no words for this. Here's what the raiders did not know. As their ships disappeared over the northern horizon, they had not just raided a monastery. They had fired a signal flare visible across the entire Christian world. The scholar Alcuin of York, one of the most brilliant minds of the Carolingian Renaissance, a man who had been the personal tutor to the Emperor Charlemagne himself, received the news of the Lindisfarne raid and sat down to write a letter. In that letter, the panic and disbelief are still palpable across 1,200 years. He could not understand it. He could not fit it into any theological framework he possessed. Why had God allowed his most sacred site to be violated? What did it mean? What was coming next? What was coming next was something Alcuin could not have imagined, even in his darkest possible reading of the omens. And here's what the Norse raiders also could not have known. They had just proven something. Something that, once proven, could not be unproven. The monasteries of Christian Europe were full of wealth. They were completely undefended. And the sea, the highway that connected them all, belonged to whoever had the fastest, most maneuverable ships. The Norse had the fastest, most maneuverable ships. Word traveled back across the North Sea with the returning raiders. Not in any formal announcement, not in any written record. Just the organic, unstoppable spread of information through a culture of seafarers and traders and warriors who all wanted to know. Did it work? Was it as rich as they said? Was there resistance? Yes, no. The next summer, raiders struck Jarrow, a few miles down the Northumbrian coast. The summer after that, they were in Scotland. Within a decade, they were in Ireland. Within a generation, they were in France, Spain, the Mediterranean, Iceland, Greenland. Within 2 centuries, they were standing on the coast of North America, 500 years before Columbus. All of it, every longship that ever beached on a foreign shore, every city that ever burned, every kingdom that ever collapsed under Norse pressure, traces a direct line back to that foggy morning on Lindisfarne when a small group of raiders discovered that the Christian world had left its door unlocked. But here's what the history books often skip. The raid on Lindisfarne did not just terrify Christian Europe. It changed it. Within decades, the coastal kingdoms of England began building something they had not needed before: early warning systems. Lookout posts on headlands, coastal watches, communication chains that could get a warning from the shore to an armed garrison faster than raiders could move inland. The Viking raids, in a brutal and unintended way, began forging something that would eventually become the unified Kingdom of England, because the existential pressure of constant raids forced the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to cooperate or die. Alfred the Great, who would eventually hold back the Great Heathen Army in 978, was shaped by a century of Viking pressure that began the year the smoke rose over Lindisfarne. The network of fortified towns he built, the burhs, was a direct response to a threat that had been escalating since 793. Even Charlemagne, his empire was changed. His successors built river forts, reorganized naval defenses, created new military hierarchies specifically designed to respond to fast-moving seaborne raiders. Medieval Europe, its defensive architecture, its castles, its fortified monasteries, its sea towers, owes a direct and traceable debt to what those Norse raiders proved was possible on a June morning in 793. The world before Lindisfarne assumed the sea was a barrier. The world after Lindisfarne knew the sea was a road. Back on the island, as the smoke thinned and the wind carried the longships east, the surviving monks faced a decision. Leave or stay? It was not an easy decision. This island was their world. These burned ruins were everything they had. The relics of St. Cuthbert, the most sacred objects in all of northern England, were still here, scattered and defiled, but still here. To leave was to abandon them. To abandon them was, in the theological logic of the time, a kind of spiritual death. But to stay was to wait for the raiders to come back. Because the survivors knew, even then, even in the immediate shock of the attack, that this was not over. This was not a unique event. This was a beginning. They could feel it. In Alcuin, this letter, written weeks after the attack, you could hear the same terrible intuition. This is not the end of something. This is the start. Some of the monks left. They gathered what could be saved of the holy relics, St. Cuthbert's bones, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and they began a journey that would eventually cover most of northern England. For over 100 years, a community of displaced monks carried their saint's remains from refuge to refuge, never entirely safe, always aware that the men who had destroyed their home were still out there, still raiding, still getting closer. St. Cuthbert's bones would not find a permanent resting place until 995. More than 200 years after the raid on Lindisfarne. 200 years of running from something that started on a single foggy morning. The island of Lindisfarne still exists. You can visit it today, driving across a causeway that floods twice a day with the tide. The ruins of the priory, not the original buildings burned in 793, but the ones built by Norman monks 3 centuries later on the same ground, still stand in the gray Northumbrian light. Gulls still circle the stones. The sea still moves around the island the way it has always moved. If you stand there in the early morning, before the tourists arrive, when the fog is still sitting low over the water and the tide is coming in, it is very easy to imagine you are hearing something. Out there on the water, a rhythmic sound, getting louder. The priors who rebuilt on this ground knew they were building on a scar. They built anyway, because that is what humans do. We build on the places where terrible things happened, and we try to make something out of the rubble. But Alcuin's question, the one he put in his letter, the one he never fully answered, still hangs over that island like the smoke never quite cleared. He asked why God had allowed it. He asked what it meant. He spent the rest of his life trying to find a framework that made it comprehensible. He never quite managed it. Because some events are not meant to be comprehended. Some events are meant to be felt. And what happened on Lindisfarne on the 8th of June, 793, is one of the truest breaks in history we have. A clean, sharp line between one world and another. Before that morning, the sea was a border. After it, the sea was an invitation. And the people who accepted that invitation would spend the next 300 years remaking the world in their image. That fog never really lifted. If this is the first thing you have ever heard about the Viking Age, you are not ready for what comes next. Drop a comment below. Do you think Lindisfarne was inevitable? That someone was always going to kick that door open eventually? Or was it a unique moment that could have gone differently? Because that argument has been running for 1,200 years, and nobody has settled it yet. Like and subscribe if you want to follow this story where it leads. Because where it leads is somewhere most history channels do not go.